Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware is made up of the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, October 31st, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Happy All Hallows Eve. Tomorrow is All Saints' Day. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world. The racism against people in foreign countries encouraged sotto voce by our government. At this moment, the U.S. is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they are nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world? Not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran. The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the accelerating profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. That elite's concern for profits has meant that the center of attention for American foreign policy for more than a century has been Eurasia, the land mass from Eastern Europe to East Asia, not Europe or the Western Hemisphere. Since at least the open door policy of 1899, the U.S. government has been determined to prevent the economic integration of the combined continental landmass of Europe and Asia, under any power, Eastern or Western, for fear that it would hinder the economic exploitation of Eurasia by the American 1%. That's what that unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s was about, conquering their greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. That's why the U.S. left Russia to defeat Hitler alone. Russia lost perhaps 27 million people in World War II. The U.S. lost perhaps 500,000 in all theaters of the war. The bedrock of U.S. foreign policy today remains the containment of Eurasia and the retarding of its economic development. The American task is more difficult today, at any time since World War II, owing to the effective alliance between Russia and China, and their effective alliance with other states, notably Iran and Syria. That's what the 1,000 military bases the U.S. has around the world are meant to contain. Russia has 15 bases outside of its territory. China has 1. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. was the only undamaged major country on either side. The situation was described in 1948 in a secret State Department memorandum by the liberal diplomat and historian George Kennan, writing for the State Department. He said, quote, "We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves and the peoples of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concerned everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction." Close quote. From World War II up to today, under the excuse of altruism and world benefaction, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people to maintain economic control of the world. President Obama was the first U.S. president in history to be at war throughout two presidential terms. In the presidential campaign, Trump criticized the 8 wars Obama was conducting. He criticized Obama's war provocations against Russia and China, and he criticized Obama's drone assassinations, accurately called the greatest terrorist program of modern times. But once in office, Trump has adopted Obama's war policies. Our anti-war group, AWARE, was formed 16 years ago after the attack on New York and Washington on 9/11/2001, and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan later that year. The founders of AWARE saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but it is in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over Eurasian economic rivals from Germany to China. As mentioned, since World War II, U.S. presidents have killed between 20 and 30 million people for the profits of the American economic elite. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It is a triumph of the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in AWARE, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations, notably Russia, China, Iran, and Syria. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, stop the drone attacks, and end the war provocations against Russia and China. 3, cut military spending by at least 50% and close the 1,000 U.S. military bases ringing Eurasia. Bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the world's countries. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. Revoke the Obama administration's trillion-dollar plan to update U.S. nuclear weapons and make them more usable. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you won't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by the pro-war U.S. political establishment. We'll try to give a better account tonight, focusing particularly on China and the provocations surrounding North Korea, which are finally about the U.S. long-standing attempt to contain China. You're watching AWARE on the Air, and I want to turn to a piece by the historian Alfred W. McCoy, who years ago wrote one of the important books to come out of the Vietnam War, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. McCoy is a professor of history at Wisconsin, emeritus now, and he has recently published a book entitled In the Shadows of the American Century, The Rise and Decline of U.S. Global Power. Part of it is a bit of historical imagination about how a war between the United States and China would work out today. The title is World War III with China, How It Might Actually Be Fought. For the past 50 years, American leaders have been extremely confident that they could suffer military setbacks in places like Cuba or Vietnam without having their system of global hegemony backed by the world's wealthiest economy and finest military, affected. The country was, after all, the planet's indispensable nation, as Secretary of State Madeleine Albright proclaimed in 1998, and other presidents and politicians have insisted ever since. The U.S. enjoyed a greater disparity of power over its would-be rivals than any empire ever, Yale historian Paul Kennedy announced in 2002. Certainly, it would remain the sole superpower for decades to come, Foreign Affairs magazine assured us just last year. During the 2016 campaign, candidate Donald Trump promised his supporters that, quote, "We're going to win with military. We're going to win so much you may even get tired of winning," close quote. In August, while announcing his decision to send more troops to Afghanistan, Trump reassured the nation, quote, "In every generation we have faced down evil and we have always prevailed," close quote. In this fast-changing world, only one thing was certain. When it really counted, the United States could never lose. No longer. The Trump White House may still be basking in the glow of America's global supremacy, but just across the Potomac, the Pentagon has formed a more realistic view of its fading military superiority. In June, the Defense Department issued a major report titled "On Risk Assessment in a Post-Primacy World," finding that the U.S. military, quote, "no longer enjoys an unassailable position versus state competitors, and it can no longer automatically generate consistent and sustained local military superiority at range," close quote. This sober assessment led the Pentagon's top strategists to the jarring realization that we can lose. Increasingly, Pentagon planners find the self-image of a matchless global leader provides a flawed foundation for forward-looking defense strategy under post-primacy conditions. This Pentagon report also warned that, like Russia, China is engaged in a deliberate program to demonstrate the limits of U.S. authority. This is the Pentagon's view, a view that, in fact, is in neither case backed up with a great deal of evidence, but that's the way they look at it on the banks of the Potomac. Hence, China's bid for Pacific primacy and its campaign to expand its control over the South China Sea, once again, the Pentagon way of looking at it, has to be opposed. Indeed, military tensions between the two countries have been rising in the Western Pacific since the summer of 2010, when Obama was president and Hillary Clinton Secretary of State. Just as Washington once used its wartime alliance with Great Britain to appropriate much of that fading empire's global power after World War II, so Beijing began using profits from its export trade with the U.S. to fund a military challenge to U.S. dominion over the waterways of Asia and the Pacific, which it had conquered in World War II. Some telltale numbers suggest the nature of the future great power competition between Washington and Beijing that could determine the course of the 21st century. In April 2015, for instance, the Department of Agriculture reported that the U.S. economy would grow by nearly 50% over the next 15 years, while China's would expand by 300%, equaling or surpassing America's around 2030. Similarly, in the critical race for worldwide patents, industrial development, American leadership in technological innovation is clearly on the wane. In 2008, the United States still held the number 2 spot behind Japan in patent applications with 230,000 for the year. China was, however, closing in fast at 195,000, thanks to a blistering 400% increase since the year 2000. By 2014, China actually took the lead in this critical category with 800,000 patents, nearly half the world's total, compared to just 280,000 for the Americans. With supercomputing now critical for everything from code breaking to consumer products, China's defense ministry outpaced the Pentagon for the first time in 2010, launching the world's fastest supercomputer, the Tianhe-1A. For the next 6 years, Beijing produced the fastest machine, and last year finally won in a way that couldn't be more crucial, with a supercomputer that had microprocessor chips made in China. By then, it also had the most supercomputers, with 167, compared to 165 for the United States and only 29 for Japan. Over the longer term, the American education system, that critical source of future scientists and innovators, has been falling behind its competitors. In 2012, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development tested 500,000 15-year-olds worldwide. Those in Shanghai came in first in math and science, while those in Massachusetts, a strong-performing U.S. state, placed 20th in science and 27th in math. By 2015, America's standing had declined to 25th in science and 39th in math. But why, you might ask, should anybody care about a bunch of 15-year-olds with backpacks, braces, and attitudes? Because by 2030, they will be the mid-career scientists and engineers determining whose computers survive a cyber attack, whose satellites evade a missile strike, and whose economy has the next best thing. With its growing resources, Beijing has been laying claim to an arc of islands and waters from Korea to Indonesia, long dominated by the U.S. Navy. In August 2010, after Secretary of State Hillary Clinton expressed a national interest in the South China Sea and conducted naval exercises there to reinforce the claim, Beijing's Global Times responded angrily that, quote, the U.S.-China wrestling match over the South China Sea issue has raised the stakes in deciding who the real future ruler of our planet will be, close quote. That was the way it was seen in both Washington and Beijing. 4 years later, Beijing escalated its territorial claims to these waters, building a nuclear submarine facility on Hainan Island. And look at a map and see where Hainan Island is. It's very roughly similar to the U.S. having military bases in, say, in Cuba. China accelerated its dredging of seven artificial atolls for military bases in the Spratly Islands. When the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague ruled in 2016 that these atolls gave China no territorial claim to the surrounding seas, Beijing's foreign ministry dismissed the decision out of hand. To meet China's challenge on the high seas, the Pentagon began sending a succession of carrier groups, aircraft carrier groups, on, quote, freedom of navigation, close quote, cruises into the South China Sea. Once again, imagine China doing that in, say, the Gulf of Mexico. It also started shifting spare air and sea assets to a string of bases from Japan to Australia, in a bid to strengthen its strategic position along the Asian littoral, the coastline of Asia. Since the end of World War II, Washington has attempted to control the strategic Eurasian landmass from a network of NATO military bases in Europe and a chain of island bastions in the Pacific, surrounding, in other words, Eurasia with American military bases. Between the axial ends of this vast continent, that is the points on which the Eurasian landmass would turn, so to speak, Washington has, over the past 70 years, built successive layers of military power, air and naval bases during the Cold War, and more recently a string of 60 drone bases stretching from Sicily to Guam, from the Mediterranean, in other words, to the Pacific. Simultaneously, however, China has conducted what the Pentagon in 2010 called a comprehensive transformation of its military, meant to prepare the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military, for extended range power projection. This is the Pentagon, that's Pentagon speak. With the world's most active land-based ballistic and cruise missile program, Beijing can target its nuclear forces throughout most of the world, including the continental United States. Meanwhile, accurate missiles now provide the PLA, the Chinese military, with the ability to attack ships, including aircraft carriers, in the western Pacific Ocean. This is the Pentagon analysis now. In emerging military domains, China has begun to contest U.S. dominion over cyberspace and space, with plans to dominate the information spectrum in all dimensions of the modern battle space. They do talk that way at the Pentagon. China's army has by now developed a sophisticated cyber warfare capacity through its Unit 61398 and allied contractors that increasingly focus on companies involved in the critical infrastructure of the United States, its electrical power grid, gas lines, and waterworks, so says the Pentagon. After identifying that unit as responsible for a series of intellectual property thefts, technical information, Washington took the unprecedented step in 2013 of filing criminal charges against 5 active-duty Chinese cyber officers. The point is that the Pentagon was worried about this. China has already made major technological advances that could prove decisive in any future war with Washington. Instead of competing across the board, Beijing, like many late adopters of technology, has strategically chosen key areas to pursue, particularly orbital satellites, which are a fulcrum for the effective weaponization of space. As early as 2012, China had already launched 14 satellites into 3 kinds of orbits, with more satellites in high orbits and better anti-shielding capabilities than other systems. 4 years later, Beijing announced that it was on track to cover the whole globe with a constellation of 35 satellites by 2020, becoming second only to the United States when it comes to operational satellite systems. Playing catch-up, China has recently achieved a bold breakthrough in secure communications. In August 2016, 3 years after the Pentagon abandoned its own attempt at full-scale satellite security, Beijing launched the world's first quantum satellite that transmits photons believed to be invulnerable to hacking, rather than relying on more easily compromised radio waves. According to one scientific report, this new technology will create a super secure communications network, potentially linking people everywhere. China was reportedly planning to launch 20 of these satellites, should the technology prove fully successful. To check China, Washington has been building a new digital defense network of advanced cyber warfare capabilities and airspace robotics. Between 2010 and 2012, the Pentagon extended drone operations into the exosphere, the level beyond the stratosphere, creating an arena for future warfare unlike anything that's gone before. As early as 2020, if all goes according to plan, the Pentagon will loft a triple-tier shield of unmanned drones reaching from the stratosphere to the exosphere, armed with agile missiles, linked by an expanded satellite system, and operated through robotic controls. This, by the way, is not Alfred McCoy's speculation. He's basing himself on exactly what the Pentagon has been saying it's planning to do, and it often says this when it's asking for money from Congress to do it, and the money is almost always forthcoming. In fact, I don't know of any time when it hasn't been. Weighing this balance of forces, the RAND Corporation recently released a study entitled War with China, predicting that by 2025, quote, China will likely have more, better, and longer-range ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, advanced air defenses, latest generation aircraft, quieter submarines, more and better sensors, and the digital communications, processing power, and C2, that stands for cybersecurity, necessary to operate an integrated kill chain, close quote. In the event of all-out war, Rand suggested, the United States might suffer heavy losses to its carriers, submarines, missiles, and aircraft from Chinese strategic forces, while its computer systems and satellites would be degraded thanks to improved Chinese cyber war and ASAT, that's anti-satellite, capabilities. Even though American forces would counterattack, their growing vulnerability means Washington's victory would not be assured. In such a conflict, the think tank concluded, there might well be no clear winner. Make no mistake about the weight of those words. For the first time, a top strategic think tank, probably the best known one, the Rand Corporation, closely aligned with the U.S. military and long famous for its influential strategic analyses, was seriously contemplating a major war with China that the United States would not win. This is Alfred McCoy taking these Pentagon and think tank reports and reading them seriously in a historical context. What he produces here is what he calls World War III Scenario 2030. In other words, what would happen if a war between the U.S. and China should break out in a dozen years. McCoy writes, the technology of space and cyber warfare is so new, so untested, that even the most outlandish scenarios currently concocted by strategic planners may soon be superseded by a reality still hard to conceive. In a 2015 nuclear war exercise, the Air Force Wargaming Institute used sophisticated computer modeling to imagine a 2030 scenario where the Air Force's fleet of B-52s, upgraded with improved standoff weapons are weapons that can send bombs from off the coast of a country into the center of it, that these planes patrol the skies ready to strike. Simultaneously, shiny new intercontinental ballistic missiles stand by for launch. Then, in a bold tactical gambit, B-1 bombers with full integrated battle station upgrades, that's a technical term too, an IBS upgrade, slip through enemy defenses for a devastating nuclear strike. This was the plan worked out in this war game process in the Pentagon. That scenario was no doubt useful for Air Force planners, but said little about the actual future of U.S. global power. Similarly, the Rand War with China study only compared military capacities without assessing the particular strategies either side might use to its advantage. Alfred McCoy writes, I might not have access to the Wargaming Institute's computer modeling or Rand's renowned analytical resources, but I can at least carry their work one step further by imagining a future conflict with an unfavorable outcome for the United States. As the globe's still dominant power, Washington must spread its defenses across all military domains, making its strength paradoxically a source of potential weakness. In other words, the U.S. must be ready for war in Europe and Latin America and Africa, as we've heard recently, and therefore the specific concentration on China, or the specific concentration that China could devote to the United States, that's no longer possible. As the challenger, China has the asymmetric advantage of identifying and exploiting a few strategic flaws in Washington's otherwise overwhelming military superiority. For years, prominent Chinese defense intellectuals like Shen-Ding Li of Fudan University have rejected the idea of countering the U.S. with a big naval buildup and argued instead for cyber attacks, space weapons, lasers, pulses, and other directed energy beams. Instead of rushing to launch aircraft carriers that will be burned by lasers fired from space, China should, Shen argued, develop advanced weapons to make other command systems fail to work. Although decades away from matching the full might of Washington's global military, China could, through a combination of cyber war, space warfare, and supercomputing, find ways to cripple U.S. military communications and thus blind its strategic forces. With that in mind, here's one possible scenario for World War III. It's 11:59 p.m. on Thanksgiving Thursday in 2030. For months, tensions have been mounting between Chinese and U.S. Navy patrols in the South China Sea. Washington's attempts to use diplomacy to restrain China have proven an embarrassing failure among longtime allies. With NATO crippled by years of diffident American support, Britain now a third-tier power, Japan functionally neutral, and other international leaders cooled to Washington's concerns after suffering its cyber surveillance for so long. With the American economy diminished, Washington plays the last card in an increasingly weak hand, deploying 6 of its remaining 8 carrier groups to the Western Pacific. Instead of intimidating China's leaders, the move makes them more bellicose. Flying from air bases in the Spratly Islands, their jet fighters soon begin buzzing U.S. Navy ships in the South China Sea, while Chinese frigates play chicken with 2 of the aircraft carriers on patrol, crossing ever closer to their bows. Then tragedy strikes. At 4 a.m. on a foggy October night, the massive carrier USS Gerald Ford slices through aging frigate 536 Zuchang, sinking the Chinese ship with its entire crew of 165. Beijing demands an apology and reparations. When Washington refuses, China's fury comes fast. At the stroke of midnight on Black Friday, as cyber shoppers storm the portals of Best Buy for deep discounts on the latest consumer electronics from Bangladesh, Navy personnel staffing the Space Surveillance Telescope at Exmouth, Western Australia, choke on their coffees as their panoramic screens of the southern sky suddenly blip to black. Thousands of miles away at the U.S. Cyber Command's Operations Center in Texas, Air Force technicians detect malicious binaries that, though hacked anonymously into American weapons systems worldwide, show the distinctive digital fingerprints of China's People's Liberation Army. In what historians will later call the Battle of Binaries, cybercom supercomputers launched their killer counter codes. While a few of China's provincial servers do lose routine administrative data, Beijing's quantum satellite system, equipped with super-secure photon transmission, proves impervious to hacking. Meanwhile, an armada of bigger, faster supercomputers, slave to Shanghai's Cyber Warfare Unit 61398, blast back with impenetrable logarithms of unprecedented subtlety and sophistication, slipping into the U.S. satellite system through its antiquated microwave signals. The first overt strike is one nobody at the Pentagon predicted. Flying at 60,000 feet above the South China Sea, several U.S. carrier-based MQ-25 Stingray drones, infected by Chinese malware, suddenly fire all the pods beneath their enormous delta wingspans, sending dozens of lethal missiles plunging harmlessly into the ocean, effectively disarming those formidable weapons. Determined to fight fire with fire, the White House authorizes a retaliatory strike. Confident their satellite system is impenetrable, Air Force commanders in California transmit robotic codes to a flotilla of X-37B space drones, orbiting 250 miles above the Earth, to launch their triple Terminator missiles at several of China's communication satellites. There is zero response. In near panic, the Navy orders its Zumwalt-class destroyers to fire the RIM-174 killer missiles at 7 Chinese satellites in nearby geostationary orbits. The launch codes suddenly prove inoperative. As Beijing's viruses spread uncontrollably through the U.S. satellite architecture, the country's second-rate supercomputers failed to crack the Chinese malware's devilishly complex code. With stunning speed, GPS signals crucial to the navigation of American ships and aircraft worldwide are compromised. Across the Pacific, Navy deck officers scramble for their sextants, struggling to recall long-ago navigation classes at Annapolis. Steering by sun and stars, carrier squadrons abandon their stations off the China coast and steam for the safety of Hawaii. An angry American president orders a retaliatory strike on a secondary Chinese target, Longpo Naval Base on Hainan Island. Within minutes, the commander of Anderson Air Base on Guam launches a battery of super-secret X-51 Wave Rider hypersonic missiles that soar to 70,000 feet and then streak across the Pacific at 4,000 miles an hour, far faster than any Chinese fighter or air-to-air missile. Inside the White House Situation Room, the silence is stifling as everyone counts down the 30 short minutes before the tactical nuclear warheads are to slam into Longpo's hardened submarine pens, shutting down Chinese naval operations in the South China Sea. At midnight, the missiles suddenly nosedive into the Pacific. In a bunker buried deep beneath Tiananmen Square, President Xi Jinping's hand-picked successor, Li Keqiang, even more nationalistic than his mentor, is outraged that Washington would attempt a tactical nuclear strike on Chinese soil. When China's State Council wavers at the thought of open war, the president quotes the ancient strategist Sun Tzu: "Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win." Amid applause and laughter, the vote is unanimous. War it is. Almost immediately, Beijing escalates from secret cyber attacks to overt acts. Dozens of China's next-generation SC-19 missiles lift off for strikes on key American communications satellites, scoring a high ratio of kinetic kills on these hulking units. A kinetic kill means they simply run into them at very high speed and destroy them. Suddenly, Washington loses secure communication with hundreds of military bases. U.S. fighter squadrons worldwide are grounded. Dozens of F-35 pilots, already airborne, are blinded as their helmet-mounted avionic displays go black, forcing them down to 10,000 feet for a clear view of the countryside. Without any electronic navigation, they must follow highways and landmarks back to base like bus drivers in the sky. Mid-flight on regular patrols around the Eurasian landmass, 24 RQ-180 surveillance drones suddenly become unresponsive to satellite-transmitted commands. They fly aimlessly toward the horizon, crashing when their fuel is exhausted. With surprising speed, the United States loses control of what its Air Force has long called the ultimate high ground. With intelligence flooding the Kremlin about crippled American capacity, Moscow, still a close Chinese ally, sends a dozen Severodvinsk-class nuclear submarines beyond the Arctic Circle, bound for permanent provocative patrols between Newport and Newport News. Sorry, let's try that again. The Russians send their updated submarines on patrol along the east coast of the United States, from New York to Virginia. Simultaneously, a half-dozen Grigorovich-class missile frigates from Russia's Black Sea Fleet, escorted by an undisclosed number of attack submarines, steam for the western Mediterranean to shadow the U.S. Sixth Fleet. Within a matter of hours, Washington's strategic grip on the axial ends of Eurasia, remember when we said Europe-Asia understood as rotating along its two extreme east and west extremes, the axial ends of Eurasia, the keystone to its global domination for the past 85 years, is broken. The U.S. containment of Eurasia is destroyed by China in the east and Russia in the west. In quick succession, the building blocks in the fragile architecture of U.S. global power start to fall. Every weapon begets its own nemesis. Just as musketeers upended mounted knights, in other words, the dominant military technology of the Middle Ages, the armored knight, was defeated by the development of firearms, which penetrated the armor. Tanks smashed trench works, the dominant form of First World War warfare, infantry in trenches, advancing against one another across the countryside, were overcome by the development of the tank, an invention of the First World War. Dive bombers sank battleships which dominated through the Second World War, were countered by the end of the war by the Japanese kamikaze, by the bombers that destroyed the battleship and made the battleship an ineffective weapon in the years after the Second World War. So China's superior cyber capability had blinded America's communication satellites that were the sinews of its once formidable military apparatus, giving Beijing a stunning victory in its war of robotic militaries. Without a single combat casualty on either side, the superpower that had dominated the planet for nearly a century is defeated in World War III. That's probably appropriate for Halloween. Alfred McCoy's imagination, well-informed imagination, of how a war between the U.S. and China would work out. McCoy, as I say, is a well-known historian, and he's paid close attention to the sort of war-making imaginations that have preoccupied American planners and also foreign planners for many a day. And it seems to me what he's produced here is something that we should take very seriously indeed when we observe the provocations against China and Russia that the last administration and the current administration in the U.S. Seem devoted to. It is a very dangerous situation, and McCoy's notion that such a war would be carried out only at the level of cyber warfare, space warfare, and so forth, without many human casualties, may be accurate, but it certainly is optimistic. You're watching Aware on the Air, where we try to talk about the war-making of the United States and the opposition to it by anti-war groups across the country and across the world, like AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana. We have a few minutes left here, and I would like to turn our attention to a couple of commentaries on the article we've just read. One, a specific historical memory that's worth thinking about in this context. On October 27th, in 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Russian officer, second in command Vasily Arkhipov, of the Soviet submarine B-59, refused to agree with his captain's order to launch nuclear weapons against U.S. warships, setting off what might well have been a terminal superpower nuclear war. Now remember, in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, President John Kennedy was willing to risk nuclear war in order to prevent the Cuban Revolution from defending itself with the help of the Soviet Union. The Kennedy White House suggested that the probability of a nuclear exchange from President Kennedy's ultimatum to Russia was at least 1 in 3. There was a 33% chance of a nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia in 1962. That was what the American government thought. The closest we now know that it came to an actual nuclear exchange came from the U.S. Patrolling the waters around Cuba and dropping depth charges near submarines that Russia had in the vicinity in an attempt to force them to the surface, unaware that these submarines, particularly the one that Vasily Arkhipov was on, were carrying nuclear weapons. They knew, of course, that there were nuclear arms available to the Russians. They didn't know these submarines were nuclear armed, or at least they said they didn't. The American government said they were not aware that these were nuclear-armed submarines around Cuba. The Soviet officers in these submarines had lost radio contact with Moscow. The U.S. was busily trying to jam the communications between the submarines and Moscow. And the officers in this submarine, 1962, October, concluded that World War III had begun and that shooting between the U.S. and Russia had already started. 2 of the officers in this nuclear submarine agreed to blast the American warships out of the water with nuclear weapons. Arkhipov, Vasily Arkhipov, the captain, the second in command rather, refused to agree. Unanimous consent of the 3 officers was required according to Soviet military practice, and thanks to him, we're here to talk about it today. The Russian command was 1 vote away of 3 from launching these nuclear weapons in response to the American provocation, and Vasily Arkhipov did nothing less than save the world. We have a few minutes left to turn our attention to what we might say for Halloween is the proper commentary on what we've heard so far. How much time do we have, gentlemen?
You've got 8 minutes.
Okay. We'll spend the last 8 minutes then.
Correction, make it 12 minutes.
Okay. We'll spend 8 of the last 12 minutes then on a comment of about a less explosive, perhaps, topic than we've been examining so far, but one that in fact may have greater long-range influence on those explosions. This is an article that suggests that the key to the upcoming petro-yuan lies in Moscow. And if the Chinese currency eventually succeeds in usurping the long-standing petrodollar, Washington will have only itself to blame. This is the economic conflict that would be the basis of the war that we have been talking about, we've been speculating about this evening, a war between China and the United States. The question here is the world economy. And that the base of the discussion is what's called the petrodollar. You may have heard that in various political discussions going on for a while, but it's rarely, I think, adequately defined or described. Petrodollar refers to money earned by a country from selling oil, petroleum. The money that a country earns for disposing of its petroleum resources, selling its oil, is evaluated these days because of the United States in dollars. The world oil price is listed in dollars, and countries that sell oil, principally in the Middle East, do it for dollars exchange. That's the petrodollar then, is the money earned by a country like Saudi Arabia from selling oil. The oil economy of the world is conducted, in other words, in American currency, in petrodollars. The suggestion is that China and allied countries, most notably Russia, are trying to substitute their own currencies, notably the Chinese RMB or yuan, for the dollar in this regard. The U.S., controlling the petrodollar, has a great deal of control over the world economy. If that control should be diluted by the existence of oil transactions carried on in yuan, in Chinese currency, the U.S. control would correspondingly lessen. News that China plans to launch a yuan-dominated oil futures contract, basically buying oil in terms of Chinese currency, by the end of this year has come to the surprise of many analysts. However, Russian experts aren't startled in the slightest, because this move has been coming since Moscow abandoned its quarter-century attempt to integrate with the West following the 2014 Ukraine crisis. 2014 Ukraine crisis was not just a local coup arranged by the Obama administration in this Eastern European region. It was also a threat to the economic domination of the world by the United States. A catastrophe in the sense that ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia had been in various ways and for various reasons attempting to incorporate its economy into the worldwide economy dominated by the United States, and the U.S., of course, had been trying to do it only in American terms. That attempt came to an end as a result of the Ukrainian crisis in 2014, a catastrophe which the Kremlin blames on the United States and the European Union as part of what it considers to be an attempt to reduce Russian influence in the near abroad. The near abroad is the Russian term for those territories that were part of the Soviet Union but are not now part of Russia. Beijing's scheme aims to shift trade in black gold, that is oil, from petrodollars to a proposed petro-yuan. That is, it wants to the oil sold by the oil-producing countries to be evaluated in their currency, which benefits China by making its currency more attractive internationally and providing greater energy security. However, the biggest winners may well be in Moscow, because any decline in the dollar status severely dilutes Washington's ability to wage economic war against Russia via sanctions. That's been a crucial part of American war provocations against Russia. As the world's biggest petroleum producer, Russia is vital to Beijing's project. And in turn, as the planet's largest crude importer and most sizable economy, China is the only country with the heft to challenge American financial hegemony. Of course, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, President of China, can't achieve their aims alone, because if the petro-yuan is to succeed, other leading oil drilling nations will need to come on board. And while Iran, Indonesia, and Venezuela have indicated their interest in the project, the key is tempting the Arab states to trade in yuan. And this essentially means Saudi Arabian cooperation is the big prize. Now you see why that was such a strange moment 2 weeks ago when the new leader of Saudi Arabia went to Moscow. Remember that President Trump had been to Saudi Arabia and had engaged in various activities which seemed to suggest that the U.S. patronage of Saudi Arabia was continuing. And now here Saudi Arabia looks like it's talking to the evil Russians. After all, the petrodollar was born in Jeddah in 1974 when U.S. Treasury Secretary William Simon convinced the Saudis that America was the safest place to park their oil revenue. And this cash flow has allowed the U.S. to live beyond its means for decades. However, in recent years, relations have become frayed, with Washington's support for its fracking industry, crushing petroleum prices, and causing severe fiscal pain for the Saudis. Indeed, the primary reason for Riyadh's, that is, Saudi Arabia's, developing détente with Russia has been a mutual desire to prevent a further slide in energy earnings. As a result, earlier this month, King Salman made a historic visit to Moscow, where the yuan plan was surely on the agenda. Informed analysts insist the Saudis will have to come on board. Yuan pricing of oil is coming, and as soon as the Saudis move to accept it, as the Chinese will compel them to do, then the rest of the oil market will move with them. The roots of the petro-yuan lie in a series of color revolutions in the former USSR, which convinced Moscow that the West would never treat it as an equal partner. This culminated in a March 2014 speech in the Kremlin's majestic Georgievsky Hall, where Vladimir Putin addressed over 1,000 Russian dignitaries. But this was no ordinary keynote, because tensions between Russia and the West were at levels not seen since the Cold War. Just a few weeks previously, Ukraine's government had been violently removed, and amid the chaos, Moscow had hastily moved to reabsorb its lost province of Crimea, a strategically important peninsula which had been controversially transferred to Kiev in 1954 when the two formed a union state. At the same time, pro-Russian protests rage in the eastern Ukrainian cities of Donetsk and Lugansk. They were protests against the U.S.-sponsored coup. Back then, a stern Putin memorably said, quote, "If you compress the spring all the way to its limit, it will snap back hard. You must always remember this." And he was talking, of course, about pressure, economic pressure on Russia. Indeed, ever since the United States imposed anti-Russian sanctions, first in 2012, ostensibly due to the death of an accountant named Sergei Magnitsky, and the European Union in 2014 in response to the Ukraine crisis, Moscow has been searching for ways to push back at the coercive measures. The retaliation towards the EU is relatively straightforward. A food import ban, which has had the positive effect of significantly boosting the domestic Russian agriculture industry after initially contributing to inflation. However, due to a much smaller interdependency in trade, it's proved even harder to get even with Washington. Until now, that is. There's little doubt Moscow is hoping to engineer a U.S. economic crisis to cripple its perpetual foe. Indeed, as CNBC notes, Russia and China have sought to operate in a non-dollar environment when trading oil. Both countries have also increased their efforts to mine and acquire physical gold, if or perhaps when the dollar collapses. If the Saudis don't play ball, they risk losing further market share, especially after new gas and oil pipelines from Russia to China begin operation next year. There's also the prospect that Chinese investors could boycott the IPO of state behemoth Saudi Aramco next year. Meanwhile, there are high expectations for the petro-yuan, because anything that weakens the American ability to wage economic war and destabilize the Eurasian space is a major win for the Kremlin. Furthermore, Putin may also consider the end of dollar dominance to be an important part of his legacy as he prepares for a likely final term as Russian president. This is an account of the circumstances that may lead to the military fantasy that we heard this Halloween from Alfred McCoy. You have been listening to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 44th week of 2017. My thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scholarly. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware. Now, this is Carl Estabrook For Karen Aram, Karen Evans Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.